Hey guys, and welcome to the Mtune walkthrough for the new firmware. We've got Scott Cooner who's going to do the walkthrough, so sit back, have a coffee, and enjoy the ride.
All right, guys. So we've got quite a few topics to go through. Firstly, we'll talk about the wheel speed filter change and the way that you configure the wheel speeds. So we bundle up the wheel speeds into wheel speed channel 1, 2, 3, 4. We've removed the way which you configured it before, which was undriven, driven, left, right. There's just so many channels, so we had to clean that up a bit. So what we've got here is the update to the form. What you do with the wheel speed 1, 2, 3, 4 is link each wheel to the corresponding channel. So the ECU doesn't care which one you do for what. My preferred preference myself is is the front left, front right, rear left, rear right. In this case, this example is a front wheel drive car. So we have drive speed front left for 1, and we have drive speed front right for 2, and so forth. Now one of the major changes is we've updated the filtering system, which has a table now, which can be spanned against a number of channels. Now, in this example here, it's spanned against a drive speed channel, but commonly you may filter your speed against the corresponding channel that you've named it as. So if you have, front left drive, it would be more common to have this to a front left drive. In this example, we've got drive speed on this, which is, it shares the same speed characteristics closely to the actual front left drive. But nonetheless, this filter ideally will be operating at it's a combination of a few filter types, but it has heavily low pass filtering traits, and it usually needs to be increased with speed. This will make a huge performance improvement with anything that you use, any sort of strategies that you're driving from it, because the output is still fast. Any filter that you do obviously will slow the system down, but this filter's quite efficient at getting a cleaner wheel speed signal without creating too many adverse effects due to delays. We've also got you may have noticed, we've got a MCU direct channel. So we have for the DIs, for the speed DIs, we would recommend using the MCU direct channel. So basically the speeds get routed past their FPGA, which can create a little bit of delay with the speed input. It's a small delay, and it's only really recommended to require this input configuration with traction, if you're going to use traction control and stuff like that. We've also tested with normal inputs, and it's still effective, but there is a marginal gain in performance by using the DI to MCU direct for this particular one, as opposed to the normal DI input, which goes through the FPGA first. So we've got this done. Another change, kind of a change we've made. Let me find it here. Okay, so all the G-Force channels have the same configuration for the filter, the same single zone setting. However, the filter's been significantly upgraded. So in the past, the filter, even on its maximum setting of 20, was very still quite noisy on the input. It was very raw from the G sensor. So we updated that as well. There's a significant performance improvement of that, which is quite useful when you're using it with functions that rely upon G-Force. So which I will go into a bit more detail later, but just be known that the G signals are a lot cleaner now, you'll see, than what they were in previous firmware versions. Moving forward, we're on to you'll notice now that we used to have 3 main V tables. We've now limited that back to 2. The reason we've done this, there's a few reasons, but one of the reasons was we wanted to liberate more resources from the ECU to for some of the functions that I'm going to be explaining soon. But also, there's a fundamental shift in the philosophy of the ECU, which is going way more into a more calculated, heavily torque-based throttle mass flow calculated ECU, which is essentially reducing the requirement for tables. So you will find the more we develop, the less tables that will be getting configured in the ECU, as opposed to our original philosophy 10 years ago was almost the more tables the better. So we've now kind of going into the realms of letting the ECU do more of the work than the user, because the functionality of the ECUs increased so massively. It's put a huge workload on the tuner calibrator. So it just makes sense now to let the ECU take a lot of that workload to make it a lot easier to get to a result quickly. So that's what you'll notice. So in support terms with the firmware update, that yes, you will not be able to use the table 3. It's gone now, and emission table 2 is also gone now. Moving forward to one of the reasons for that is that we've heavily updated the throttle mass flow model in the ECU, and will continue to do so. So many of the settings are the same as the last. So you still enter your throttle body size, and you still have the ability to scale that if need be. You still have the same throttle body area table. The throttle mass flow setup has changed a little bit. I'm not sure if we had this before in 2018, but we have an ability to calibrate the throttle, check the calibration of the throttle area by entering torque limits and comparing against the reported torque, making sure that that's been configured correctly. One of the main changes that we've done also is we've added a filter, an improved filter as well, and this helps especially with the transient response with the throttle. You'll notice that it will track a lot closer to a true airflow than what it previously had done with like high speed transients. We still have the same outflow scaler, which this comes into effect more heavily in pressure ratios closer to 1, and this has actually been changed a lot in the background, but to the user level, you won't see too dissimilar numbers than what you'll normally see from previous versions of firmware. Now, that said, we are talking about the pressure ratio of 1, and just to clarify, pressure ratio of 1 is when the boost pressure before the throttle plate in comparison to the pressure in the manifold are equal or close to equal to one another. And so what we have done is we've generated a new channel which allows you to clamp the throttle plate based on the throttle area based on an ECU calculated theoretical pressure ratio of 1. And now this channel is called throttle area to achieve PR1 percentage. Now this is important if you're to be using functions that I will be talking about, which are torque-based functions involving throttle, that allows the ECU to limit how much the throttle plate needs to go to achieve this pressure ratio of 1. So for example, if you are at, in this case, I've configured this to 71 for a pressure ratio calculated value of 70. Now that's basically 1 more than what the ECU is calculated, which means we'll have a 1% error in this case. At 5,000 RPM, the throttle area will be clamped to 71. Now that should achieve the same pressure ratio as if you just had the throttle wide open, throttle 100%. Now why this is important is you should achieve the same torque at 71% as you would at 100, all things being equal. But what if you want to do a torque reduction? It would seem to make not a lot of, based on throttle, would seem insane to be running a throttle reduction from 100 to pass through 71 for zero change in actual torque output, only to be, you know, falling to a lower calculated throttle. So this is quite effective. It's easy to test on a dyno because you know, you would test it with 100% throttle plate, and then you'll like load a table like this. You would start with a 1-to-1. So in this case, it's been corrected slightly for an error in the system, to make sure that it achieves that close to pressure ratio of 1. And of course, you just overlay the torque and power, and if it's configured correctly, you should see the same power and torque on the dyno between 100% throttle plate and what the ECU is calculated as a pressure ratio of 1. Now, if you don't, you either have two issues. One of which is that your throttle body area table is incorrectly entered, meaning that you don't have the correct throttle area for a given position of plate, or the outflow scalar is incorrect as well. Now that's easy because if you don't have enough plate, it's like for your pressure ratio of 1, or you have too much plate, that will be a function of this number being too high or too low. And it's very easy to experiment with by just reducing the number or increasing the number. So increasing the number will reduce the output calculated throttle mass flow at these close to pressure ratios of 1. And so if you reduce the number, it will increase the driven output flow for lower plate positions. So, you know, if it's already overdriving the output airflow calculated, it's going to keep wanting to close the throttle more. So you need to reduce its output by increasing this number to make the plate want to open more, to achieve the pressure ratio of 1. So what's all this for? Well, we're basically putting a lot more emphasis into aspects of running the engine and calculating the air mass through the throttle mass flow calculation, in conjunction with the speed density, which is, you know, obviously done from volumetric, more based from a VE table. Now, the more time goes on, the more we develop our air mass flow model, the less reliance on this VE table kind of setup it will be. So this should make it a lot easier for the calibrators long term, especially when we can get a good repository of throttle area tables and configurations for TMF. You'll find that, you know, with a number of 5 minutes, 10 minutes, you'll have a very well running engine without actually having to calibrate, you know, a VE table. So that's why we're putting a lot more effort into that, and we'll continue to do so. Now, why are we making sure that we have really well calculated throttle mass flow calculations? Well, all of our development is pushing into torque limiting, to, you know, as opposed to classical cutting, retarding ways of reducing torque. So we still do cut and still do retard, and we still do close the throttle, but now all of the calculations will account for the throttle, the cutting, and the retarding effects that come in to give you the output torque. So what we have here is this runs us into torque limit strategy that will be used. So this is new. Now we have a menu system where you can pick strategies. We have up to 5 at the moment, which basically dictate how the ECU pulls torque from the engine. So if you could potentially make this strategy be a cut only type strategy, you could have it a retard only strategy, you could have a throttle only strategy, or you could have a combination of all 3. Now, the priority system allows you to select which one has a priority first of reducing torque. Now, in this case, throttle is a primary priority of means for reducing torque. The ignition retard is the next, and then cutting is the last. Now, how does the ECU decide when to start going to retard? Well, that's dictated by these clamp values. So generally, it's it's good if you could run a torque reduction system with throttle, and in my opinion, throttle and retard for many times is quite effective. Knowing that throttle is a bit slow, the ECU, if you had a throttle only system with this priority based, but you still have retard as a second priority, it will instantly, as the throttle's closing, even though you've asked it to do throttle only, it will use the retard for a small period of time whilst the throttle is closing to take up the slack of the torque reduction until the throttle achieves its desired. Now, my advice would be is to always have torque stored in the engine when possible by having at least some of your torque reduction still potentially using some ignition retard. Now, it could be a small amount, 0 to certainly less than 10 degrees. Now, how you drive it into more retard would be increasing the minimum clamp of the throttle. So if you had the minimum clamp here set to 100, then the ECU would say, okay, I want to use the throttle, close the throttle. Oh, no, I can't. It's 100%. All right, what's my next thing in line? Okay, I'm going to do retard. Now, in this example here, this is quite aggressive in a retard strategy. So it's got a flat line of, okay, 20 degrees, right? So it can pull 20 degrees of timing. If it says, well, hey, I need more torque out than 20 degrees is calculated to give us, then we're going to need to do cut. And in this case, it says, okay, well, the cut limit is 40. You can do 40% cutting. Now, if it needed more, you would not meet your torque target. The torque would run away. So if you had this at 90, 100, then yeah, sure, you would reach that. But ideally, your strategy is set up that you should need to very rarely run into priority 3. I mean, and this is depending on the torque limiting strategy that's required, like a launch control, anti-lagging kind of system. Obviously, going to want a lot of maybe some cutting, a lot of retard, and probably not much, if any, torque reduction due to throttle. You would select a strategy, which I will demonstrate soon. You'll select a strategy that's more like that. If you want something just to kind of reduce the torque of the overall global function of the engine, you don't want to be driving the car, with just constantly cutting and retarding to maintain the desired torque. So that's where you'll heavily be using the throttle. Now, another setting that's been added is torque limit boost target margin table. Now, the ECU, when you have it set as turned on, which is set here, boost target override, when you have it on, this table here comes into effect, and also the ECU will calculate. It will basically go back through the calculations for air mass and determine what the boost target should be for that target. Now, that's very useful because if you have a really, really high boost target and you're using a heavily throttle or even throttle cutting or everything, you're going to need a lot more effort from the torque reduction system to pull the torque out if you've got the boost target very, very high. So the ECU will automatically calculate the boost target to allow the torque reduction to reduce its requirement for torque reduction. However, there are instances, and very commonly, that you would want to run, you want to overshoot this target. So if you put, like in this case, it's got 30, so that will increase the target by 30, and what that will allow you to do is have the turbos, not just completely opening the wastegates and dropping the boost too much and creating a kind of a laziness response when the torque needs to be recovered. Okay, so we have these strategy types. How do we leverage these strategy types? Because these are only just ultimately rules for how the ECU is meant to be pulling torque out of the engine, and we have 5 different strategies that can be leveraged. Okay, what can leverage these strategies? Well, there's a number of functions. One of which is the new CAN. We have the new CAN torque limit base. Very, very simple. We have an advertised document which we'll issue out. But ultimately, this simple setting allows you to send a CAN torque request from any device from a predetermined address that Emtron will provide, and it allows you to also select the strategy of which that that CAN bus torque request would leverage. So a lot of people like to make their own, torque limiting based functions or speed limiting based functions, and they could do that through, commonly probably would be a dash, I would say, that has some advanced functions. They could CAN bus that over. It's also can be leveraged for some OEM, CAN decoding applications as well. So that's one way. More commonly, we've added a user. We've added a user torque limit option, which we have 5 functions available. How this is enabled, it's vis controlled enabled. We have a new tab here under user torque limits, and it's label control, and that label is stored in the ECU, so you don't forget what it is when you come back to it sometime afterwards. But in this case, I've just turned on a user torque limit user 1 and labeled as test limit. Okay, so now that's on, and now what we can do is we can see this torque limit now. These other ones are grayed out, and it's called a test limit. Okay, so what are we going to do with this test limit? Okay, well, first we're going to need to find out, we're going to have to tell it what strategy it needs to use. And so in this case, it's strategy 1. So just as what's been outlined before, engine torque limit strategy setup here. This one here, it's going to use this strategy. Pretty easy. Okay, so normalized gear. Now off would mean, so torque target gear normalized. So what that is if you have it off, anything that's entered into the table, the torque limit table, it will give. So if you have a target of, say, 500 Newton meters, which would be in this table here, or in this case, it's 200 Newton meters, it would just always put it at 200 no matter what. Now, that might not be useful, because if you have a transmission with different gear ratios, you're going to be generating different tractive force. So you would want if you have this option here where this is set to 3rd gear, what that means is the torque will equate to exactly what the torque is in the table when you're in 3rd gear, and it will scale the torque based on the gear ratios in any other gear automatically for you, which makes it very, very simple to calibrate some kind of torque limit strategy that you want, and you want to make sure that you get that same amount of torque at the wheel in other gears. So it's pretty straightforward. Here we have the way to enable the user to enable the user torque limit. In this case, I've just configured it up at user channel 11, which leads on to that we have now added another 5 user channels to the ECU that can be configured. These do not have table control like the 1 to 10. They basically have the same logic options of enabling the status of it being on and off. Now here I have set up a, call it, torque enable. I've configured it as channel 1 only. And basically if keypad 1 is equal to 1, it will turn on this torque limit. So basically a button press will enable it. But you can do any strategy you want to. The user config setup has changed from what it was previously, and now you have a large list, and it can be grown reasonably easy. But we have a large list of compare logic that you can set up for, and it's very easy to know how that logic's working because the formula is built into the menu item. And then once you set it up for these, whichever logic you would prefer, you just go through and select the channels and the conditions and the values associated with it. We removed the 2-tab system, which had the delay time in the 2nd tab, and a lot of the support guys would, I'm sure, have had many a time where they had to go in and set up someone's on and off delays that they didn't realize were in effect with the user channel. So that's now on the same screen, which is much easier. All right, so moving on with the torque limit table, we also have a correction table as well. Now, this allows you to bend the torque table by a percentage. So you could reduce or increase the torque from the main table by percentage, which is pretty cool. So you could put whatever conditions you like based on what's in the axis setup in this 3D table, and it could bend and modify whatever you had in the primary table. So it's very useful, very powerful, and yeah, there's so many applications I can imagine people would want to use this for. We have, as I said earlier, we have 5 of these that can be configured, and of course you may have different strategies that you want to set up for each torque. You don't have to just use strategy 1, or you can pick whichever one you want. Now the other functions in the ECU which can leverage this now currently, and this will most likely change moving forward to a more heavily torque-based ECU, is the launch control and the traction control. So previously, the launch control was kind of ultimately, or every function of the ECU would basically be its own system. It didn't report to the main, the main control of the engine control. It was basically its own system, do its own thing. Now with the launch control and traction control, those functions essentially are reporting to the and abiding by a strategy system. So all of the other functions in launch control are the same as previously, except for we have added a couple of different conditions to the transfer user channel to allow to sort of save a user channel, if you will. We've just had a clutch switch off, trans brake off. We can add some more to that if needed as well. We've also we have user channel 16 to 20 in this iteration. However, this release will only have user channel 11 to 15. Now, the strategy, as you would already know, we have a static mode and a moving mode, and now as the strategy of torque reduction gets selected from these 3D tables. So we have a 3D table for launch static strut select and launch moving strut select. They're both the same style of table. In this case, it's got a full table setup of 2, which means that it's using strategy 2. So what's strategy 2? So we've gone here, we've set up strategy 2 already, torque limit strategy 2. And this one uses, okay, so now this one's using a throttle area and ignition retard. Now, priority 3 of ignition retard is kind of useless, but ultimately this is a throttle and ignition retard strategy. Probably more likely you would have to set up the cut. Ignition only, you may, if you want to really spool the turbo pretty hard. Now, what happens is when it's in static mode, it will use that strategy, and then the moment that it goes into moving mode, it'll leverage the strategies in moving mode. Now, for simplicity's sake, if you want to just kind of run old school, how you were before, most people would be running maybe a cutting and retard combination. You would just set it to, you would pick a strategy you want to use for launch control and select both the static and the moving to that, and then just make sure that the torque strategy setup is set up accordingly. So you will just have a retarding and a cutting, or cutting and retarding priority strategy, and throttle wouldn't come in. You may choose to keep it as a throttle, but you might just clamp the throttle to 100%, which means it won't use it or move on to priority 2 anyway. So that's, or you can even change the way that the throttle clamping behaves in the strategy. So the possibilities are almost endless with how you leverage the strategies. You can also move the strategy throughout the course of whatever's in these axes. So you could change a number of strategies in a static or moving mode. Drag car could be useful because you might have a car that you might want some kind of pre-staging, pre-spooling kind of static mode, which is doesn't create too much heat, but it does get a little bit of turbo energy. And then you can kind of maybe based on a simple throttle position or something like that, let it go into a much more retard, lots of heat, lots of turbo spool, but allow you to kind of like, switch between that type of mode, as opposed to sort of just cooking the thing, waiting for your competitor to kind of catch up with this, before they stages and then get you to go. The other function, which has changed radically, is the traction control function. So this also is based on a strategy system. Now, for this release, you are limited to whichever strategy that you choose for the torque, for the traction mode. So in this case, it's strategy 1. We may consider adding a table that allows you to change the strategies for the traction control. But for this release, it's basically, you pick a strategy, you optimize that strategy to around traction control, and make it work from there. Now, the difference with this is the ECU ultimately has the extra settings we have is we also have the torque target gear normalized channel, similar to, well, exactly the same as what I demonstrated for the torque limits. This one would mean that the feed forward torque, which I'll show you shortly, will also be scaled based on the gear you're in. So the best idea would be is to choose a gear that's more suitable to calibrating. In this case, a second gear. Something that obviously you want to have enough torque to the wheels that can generate wheel slip. You may try. I would try to use a higher gear if possible, higher gears if possible, but to normalize your torque around. But whatever's suitable to the user. We have a traction response time setting added. Now this one ultimately accounts for lag in the system, and most of that lag is the vehicle. So when you command a torque change, there's inertia in the engine and the drivetrain. So it's going to take some time for those changes to come in effect. You can't just you could turn the engine off during a high wheel speed, high wheel spin. It's not just going to instantly go back to 0% slip. That's impossible. So this is added into the calculations to account for that. This feed forward table is kind of the basis of the system. So in this example, we're correcting for rear axle speed in this example. It looks like quite a very moderate correction. Commonly, you would probably, if you were to calibrate it this way, you would be accounting for the downforce or not downforce lift effects of the car. So if it's a motorsport environment, which it should be used in, most race cars have got downforce. So you would expect that you can, for any gear, consider it's been normalized to a gear, you could have a higher feed forward torque because of the downforce effects that are at play. This is spanned against the rotary switch, which the idea would be this vehicle's front-wheel drive turbocharged K-series engine, one of the more difficult platforms to front-wheel drive K-series turbos, one of the more difficult platforms to control wheel slip. Now we've got, this has been calibrated reasonably well in a wet condition and dry conditions, for particular surface. I would recommend, for most applications to have a calibration system similar to this, with having, you could use a rotary dial or a keypad button press or something like that to calibrate it for different track conditions. Now, commonly I've seen 20 to 30% variation between a track in torque, normalized torque, from wet to dry conditions, but that could obviously is going to change vehicle to vehicle. So it's important to try to achieve a feed forward torque that's somewhat close to the slip target. Now, the best way to kind of test it, I would recommend, is that you would have the system completely off, have all of your engine model calibrated well, and pick a gear that's going to, and then drive it into wheel spin or wheel slip. When you do that, try to, if you have a slip target, let's say at 10, have it so it sort of doesn't just blow straight past it, but kind of have it so you kind of have it so it can progressively slip past that. Other ways I've calibrated this system is just have a race car without it. That makes a lot of power and heavily reliant on the driver, and you'll get an abundance of data from the vehicle, and with the Mtune logging or the soon to be released log viewer, you should be able to come up with some good data screens to compile a lot of information as to where the torque, like where the profile of the slip profile versus the torque is. I would suggest having the feed forward set up underneath where it commonly will be under the slip target, but over zero, so enough to drive it into the function, ultimately functioning, but not so much where it has to do a lot of effort to kind of catch that slip target. Now we have feed forward correction tables, a number of those, and these basically allow you to bend this feed forward on a number of conditions. So the most obvious conditions will be G-force characteristics, so lateral G being obviously a huge effect from the cornering forces. You may have vertical G has also got a big effect, even longitudinal G, because it affects the force over the tire. So that can come into effect. There could be any number of conditions that you might want to use to correct it. You could span one of these to a rotary switch if you wish. If you had other ideas for how you wanted to run your primary feed forward table, it's no problem. This one, I set up this one for this car, and what this does is after the first step of calibrating the feed forward, I'll recommend running the system on so it can leverage this feed forward table with zero PID gain. So start with nothing. So it's acting in an open loop means and relying purely on the feed forward tables and the correction tables. Now, what this little table does essentially creates, it's spanned against, it's not doing anything in the y-axis as you can see, but it's spanning against the target error of zero, and what it does is it provides a level of, I guess you would call it proportional gain, torque reduction before it reaches the slip target. Now, historically, we've had slip, traction control systems set up where, you would have a P proportional integral derivative. The derivative might come in, but the P is not doing anything until it sort of builds up or anything useful until it kind of goes past the negative, goes into negative error. So we've kind of like just built away as a bit of a step of torque against versus the feed forward, crossing the 0 point here. For rear-wheel drive race cars, I've found a similar, very effective. However, much less. So maybe even less than that. So that's like half the amount I've got here. Probably even less than that. You may have a predetermined percentage trim, something like this. And so what this does is when you've got the feed forward set up well, you'll find it'll kind of want to drive into sort of this region here. And then what we do is we usually rely on the PID to kind of like just to really like get academic and trim it right up to the zero error point. That's my personal experiences anyway. So yeah, front wheel drive for many obvious reasons, but it needs a more aggressive approach to when it goes from sort of a low slip, zero slip to like a high slip. The transition is quite fast and rapid commonly. Rear wheel drive is less, so it's a lot more lazy, I guess, if you will, with the way it transfers. Even with a very, very high power car, front wheel drive is just much bigger, quicker transition, no slip to high slip conditions. So here we've got some other tables that we can leverage. Now, I have found myself a huge benefit to correcting for lateral G-force. We've got one preset. Okay, so at the moment it's doing nothing, but it would be very common to at least at 1G, depending on the downforce characteristics of the car, you know, you're probably at least something like this. I mean, this is pretty quick and dirty, but will look a bit more curvy than that. But you get a very big drop off. So again, the easy way to check this is get some good data from the race car with the system off, and yeah, logging the lateral G forces versus the tractive force or the torque of the engine, and you'll see very graphically that when the driver is trying to get back onto the power, you'll see it will much easily create slip when he's got lateral load, because the tire's doing it's doing multiple jobs. It's not just trying to longitudinally get grip, it's laterally as well, as making a huge effect. So that is probably one of the more important settings that needs to be done, at least on a circuit car, to make the system work much better, because you don't have any you got less PID gains that you need to sort of apply. The PID, we have the same sort of slip target, same sort of offset as before. We have Z-axis, all that kind of controls, which allow you to kind of like bend the way the slip targets work. A lot of my own sort of configurations myself would probably leverage. This has got a static slip target 8. They would more likely reduce the slip target on a lateral G basis, and we would also run a slip modification based on throttle position, so the driver gets like a positive torque feel even while the system's working. So if he runs it into slip and he's got heavily high corner loads, and as he progresses on the pedal, he's wanting more. Obviously, he's wanting more torque. He's trying to rotate the car potentially more. So it could be beneficial to increase the slip target, under those conditions. So PID, it's all pretty much the same as it was. So we have a integral control rate setting in there. That system is there. That's there basically to run a lot slower than the main system, which is very fast. The integral rate essentially just allows to reduce the wind up by slowing it. So we found we're running the rate of the integral a bit slower, or a lot slower than the main control algorithm. That reduces the amount of wind up that you get with the system. When you have the feed forward tables all set up really well with percentage offsets based on good data, and you have the TMF set up well, and all your torque models set up well, the PID settings are very, very they become a hell of a lot less important. Just like most systems, most PID systems with good feed forwards. In this case, here's a common. This is the front wheel drive, but you can see here very little amount of gain required to kind of control the wheel slip. Integral much the same. So in this example, I just make sure the feed forward drives into some amount of error, sort of in this 2 to 4, 6 range. And that lets the integral, gives it a moderate amount of gain to sort of track it into the zero slip target. And that's proven to be reasonably effective. Derivative gain, in this case, we've got a gain of 6 here. That seems to be a pretty good place to be. But again, don't touch any PIDs until you get that feed forward and those tables set up right. Moving back on the wheel speed channels, we've put a lot of filtering improvements in that, which has probably been one of the bigger improvements in the system. So I've got a little example here. This is the slip target from this vehicle. As you can see, it tracks like really well. Probably could be a bit better, but that'd be attributed to me not being as good as I could be. Ultimately, you can get the system tracking like really, really well once you get it dialed in well. So you can see here you got the driver demand torque, and then you've got various channels associated with the ECU pulling torque out to try to control this. You'll see here there's a lot of like ignition retard, trimming going on. The throttle's closing, so it's 27% at this case, and it's tracking well. This is as I explained earlier, the integral gain kind of winding up to kind of pull it up to the target. So it's sort of we've got the feed forwards kind of got us here, and now we've got a little bit of P coming in, very moderate amount of P, which is the way I've set it. And that sort of, gradually is pulling it up into the target. And then the PID sort of sitting there trimming, trying to hold it. But it's not doing huge. It's not really needing to do an insane amount of work. In a perfect world, these values are basically zero. And then that's based on how good your torque feed forward is. We've also got latching speed, latching G speed, which can be used. It could be used for traction control, it could be used for roll racing potentially. And here's a setting right here. Now, the difference to how it used to work is now you can, which you always could, you had a reference speed which reference against. This would be like a starting speed for the system. So, and like so it would be zeroing. So before it would zero when the car was, the vehicle would be zero, not moving. It would zero the calculation and then start using the G-force to calculate the speed. In this case, a user channel can be leveraged now to latch when the G speed starts calculating or when it doesn't calculate. And you can do whatever you want there, however you want. And in this case, looks like I've got like an engine torque. So if the engine torque's less than 100, it basically starts syncing itself to the front axle speed in this case. And then as it goes more, it starts calculating the G speed based on from the speed that it was at 100 Newton meters. And we also have some delays to here. So I'll put a 1 second delay, which means when the system is basically, when this channel's on, it's using that speed. It's a little bit of delay before it starts using the drive speed for its speed to sync from. Now it'll work identical to the way it used to before, like in a drag car. The car's not moving, it will just do the same thing, assuming that you've set a channel here that kind of makes sense. It will just work the same. That also has tables. I'm not sure if this file has that. Yes. Okay, so we've also got correction tables now. So we've got a number of axes there, settings that you could use, and that is to correct the G speed calculated output for increasing and reducing. So positive and negative. Where is it? Lost it. Yeah, so positive and negative. So as the negative effects of all the reducing G-force, negative Gs, you can scale it based on that, and then you can scale it based on the positive. So with these table settings and with latching set up to an appropriate speed channel at the right time, you can get some very, very accurate outputs that are calculated by G speed. So for things that have got drag cars that have got wheels in the air, and four-wheel drive cars that have all sorts of things going on, you could build up quite easily a reliable, reasonably reliable speed channel, to perform strategies from most likely traction control or torque limiting strategies. I think we'll move on to Declan for now for some Mtune discussion.
Sure. Well, that's quite a chunk, Scott. There's quite a lot of new cool stuff going on.
Yeah, there's probably a bit more than that, but I think that's about enough, at least for this first conversation.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we've spent a fair bit of time in the last couple of months giving Mtune a birthday, basically, and probably it's very obvious from Scott navigating around the software before that it looks quite different, and that's probably the single largest change, even though it takes up one line as a dot point on the release notes. But like basically every single thing in this software has been touched in some way. I need to get rid of my panel here because I can't access. There it goes. Everything in the software has been touched in some way, so it all kind of looks very uniform now, and it's much more cohesive in its layout, and visual style. Rather than sort of being, some stuff was dark and some stuff was light, and a mishmash of the two. Along with that, there's been, updates to, like, basically everything's been touched, and like form layouts have been, tweaked and made sure that everything, fits on the screen properly, and we try to make it so that it's all tidy as best we can. There's been a few little creature comforts, like now when you press the P key to pause the runtimes, you get a little notification that the runtimes have been paused, which it's driven me nuts in the past, where I've gone, why is everything frozen? Because I didn't realize I pressed the P key. What else we got? We've made a big improvement to backwards compatibility. So all of these menus are now loaded dynamically based on the ECU that's connected, or the file that's open. So if you connect to a 218.0 ECU, you will get the menu system to suit the 218.0 firmware. And then if you connect or load a file for the new firmware, you'll get the new menu to suit. So everything's a lot more backward compatible. We've added user labels, now sort of globally visible throughout the software. So if you go into user functions and specify some sort of user output label, it's now sort of visible pretty much everywhere. So you can see it in your F3 window, you can see it in the logger, you can see it in the menus. It'll show up in like axis setup. So if you select a user function as an axis, you can see which one you're using. And we've expanded that to include all of the user input channels as well, and the torque limits. So it's a lot more easy to read what's going on. There's the logger has got some minor updates. We can now calculate logging time, which is a nice feature. So you can get an idea of how your choice of logging rates can, affect the total logging time available. And if you turn off data sets, you're going to see this change. And if you change the log memory size, you'll see all of that change. I've added a little tool that will help people configure their Ethernet setup, which is something that we see a lot in support, because you need a static IP to enable the connection to the Emtron ECU. So if you're disconnected from an ECU, after a few seconds, you're going to get this little notification, and you can basically use the tool to, configure the Ethernet for the Emtron, or return it to default if you want as well. Help's been heavily updated both inside the ECU and online. So there should be quite a few more topics that are filled out. So if you press F1 on something, you're going to see more information. And we've gone through quite a few of the contextual help in a lot of the areas, such as in the torque strat setups. We've put a bit of effort into making sure that the priority system is fleshed out. The new user outputs function that you would have seen when Scott was showing through the software before, it's a lot more readable, and we've tried to make it so that if you choose a different logic configuration, it's very obvious what's going on and which which conditions are being sort of grouped together. The race timer has been updated, so if I turn it on, the race time has now got a much higher resolution, and it uses the same logic setup as everything else. So instead of just being limited to a handful of channels that can turn it on and off, we've now got the full host of customizable logic to enable the race timer, just like all the other timers, and you can label them as well, and they're globally visible throughout the software too. Oh, one other really cool thing. We get asked in support a lot for how the speed scalers work. We've added a little calculator. So if you're wondering how the hell these scalers work, we've made it so that you can enter the number of teeth, hit calculate, it'll give you the scalar and put that in for you. And then with like output shaft speed, you can do the same sort of thing. So if you've got, say, a speed sensor on your wheel, but you're trying to derive output shaft speed from it, you can do the same thing where you can put the number of teeth on the sensor and into the final drive ratio, and it will calculate the scalar for you. The final drive ratio is pulled from the actual setting in Mtune. So in vehicle dynamics, in vehicle main, the final drive ratio here, that'll be the default that it fills in that final drive ratio for you in the scalar calculator. Same with the wheel diameter. If you're in the wheel speed setup and you want to figure out the scalar, it'll pull the rolling diameter from that setting from elsewhere in the software for you and try to figure out the scalar. So it should make setting up speed sensors far simpler for everyone, which is the idea. If you update an ECU from, say, 2180 to this new firmware, there's going to be a whole pile of things that are, well, for lack of a better term, might break. Like, we've removed fuel table 3 and ignition table 3 to make way for a lot of these new torque strategy tables. And in the handful of people that might actually be using those tables, that kind of thing might need updating. And then because you're loading all these new functions into an ECU that has memory set up in a certain way that's been changed, things might be totally unconfigured. So we've made it so that when the firmware gets updated, the ECU, like the Mtune, detects that you've updated the firmware in an ECU, and it will run this little firmware update wizard that detects the previous version and then the new version. And it'll walk you through what's been changed, and you can select what things you want it to default for you. And it will give you usable starting functions or starting points and zero tables out, so things don't do wild, crazy stuff that you weren't expecting. And then when you get to the end of it, you get a summary of what it's going to change for you, and then we can punch execute, and it'll apply all those changes in the background. Job done. And now, yeah, all the tables for your torque strategies and all of that will be zeroed out. You'll have sort of usable base points, so hopefully it won't do anything unexpected, and you can use that as a starting point. We've also added the calculator to turbo speed functions, so you can now put in the blade count on the turbo and the sensor divider, and get a usable scalar done for you. So yeah, I mean, that's going to stop me scratching my head every time I have to set that up, let alone everyone else. Yeah, you can. This seems like a really minor feature, but I'm sure it'll help a bunch of people. You can now like multi-select a whole bunch of channels and hit remove, which is cool. And also, if you go into the add channels function, double clicking a channel always used to put it into the new data set, but you can also now double click to get rid of it too. So just speeds up workflow that little bit.
Nice.
And then we've added a very powerful user menu system. So super useful for, if people have got customers who only want to change a handful of things in their ECU when they're out at the track, and they don't want, all of these menu systems, which, that a lot of customers are terrified they'll change something they shouldn't. So, you can go into user menu setup and you can create a new menu, and you can, add whatever you want, call it whatever you want, target it as a table or a function, and then, give save it to a file, give it to your customer, and they can have access to just that menu. And if you load a menu from a file, you'll get this big structure like this. And if you apply it, it appears up here. And these are targeting tables that exist in the ECU. So this might be ignition table 1, but in this menu it's been called base ignition, and then it's just ignition table 1 essentially. But you can structure this in a way that makes sense to the application or to the customer at hand. So I think that's it's pretty useful, and pretty powerful to set things up in a way that suits the package that you're working for. So we've been updating the online help in the background as well. There's obviously big updates to the firmware release notes. These will actually get presented to anyone who clicks the firmware update in Mtune, so that immediately you can see what's changed, and highlighted in red are things that are pretty important that someone should know before they go ahead and update the firmware. Then we've got a bit more fleshed out in the torque management side of things. We've added topics for all the torque limit strategies and how they work, user torque limits, etc. And this will continue to be updated. Obviously, it's online, so over the next couple of weeks, we'll keep fleshing this out and push the updates out. So we fill this out as much as we can before everyone starts using it.